Good day, welcome to the channel. It's your host, Godwin Wonder. And I'm coming to you today with another video to talk about the transatlantic slave trade and try to make sense of it from the Bible's perspective. I imagine today there are many who are descended from slaves who also profess the Christian faith. And I imagine that at times they are conflicted about what happened to their ancestors. I also imagine that there are those in that population, meaning descendant of slaves, who are angry with God and don't understand why He would even allow that to happen to their descendants. So let's talk about it. And really, to make any sense of what happened to the slaves, and I'm speaking particularly about slaves who were shipped out of West Africa mostly and taken to the Americas. Let's go back to the Bible. Remember the sons of Israel? The patriarch Abraham and his relationship with God. So God told Abraham that He would multiply his descendants and that He would cause his descendants to inherit the land of Canaan. But before all of this would happen, He told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land. We happen to know this foreign land was Egypt. And that after many years, 450, give or take, they would be, God Himself would bring them out of this foreign land and cause them to possess Canaan, the land which God had promised to Abraham. So God declared to Abraham what would happen in the future because He's omniscient, right? Now I want us to consider exactly how the sons of Israel ended up as slaves in Egypt. Was it because that's what God had appointed for them all along? They could not circumvent that situation because it was ordained by God. Is that how history works? Not necessarily. God doesn't really force us to do anything. He's given human beings free will. He just is powerful enough to navigate our decisions and choices so that in the end His will is accomplished. I don't fully understand how God works. Nobody does. Right? I mean, if we did, then we would essentially be God Himself. So we don't. We're going to leave that. And that really, to make any sense of what happened to the slaves, and I'm speaking particularly about slaves who were shipped out of West Africa mostly and taken to the Americas. Let's go back to the Bible. Remember the sons of Israel? The patriarch Abraham and his relationship with God. So God told Abraham that He would multiply his descendants and that He would cause his descendants to inherit the land of Canaan. But before all of this would happen, He told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land. We happen to know this foreign land was Egypt. And that after many years, 450, give or take, they would be, God himself would bring them out of this foreign land and cause them to possess Canaan, the land which God had promised to Abraham. So, God declared to Abraham what would happen in the future because he's omniscient, right? Now I want us to consider exactly how the sons of Israel ended up as slaves in Egypt. Was it because that's what God had appointed for them all along? They could not circumvent that situation because it was ordained by God. Is that how history works? Not necessarily. God doesn't really force us to do anything. He's given human beings free will. He just is powerful enough to navigate our decisions and choices so that in the end, his will is accomplished. I don't fully understand how God works. Nobody does, right? I mean, if we did, then we would essentially be God himself. So we don't. We're going to leave that to the Almighty, okay? Because he has the power, he has the knowledge. Only he possesses immortality. He's able to make it happen. But I digress. I want to take you back to Jacob and his sons. Remember, Jacob was first, Leah was first given to Jacob, even though he worked the 7 years really for Rachel. Interesting how that worked out, because Jacob chose deception. Remember when he deceived his father, disguised himself as though he was Esau, his brother, right? If you remember, and got Esau's blessing in that way. Jacob absolutely did not have to do that, just so we understand, right? God is faithful to keep his promise. We do not have to pull strings here and there, engage in deceptive mechanisms to make God fulfill his promise. We don't need to do that. And Jacob would pay dearly for his deception because his uncle, Laban, was also a clever one, right? He also deceived Jacob. I'm sure that was not fun. In any case, Jacob ended up with not 2, but about 4 wives. His true love was Rachel. But Leah had also been given to him first, and then the maidservants of both Leah and Rachel were added. And so Jacob ended up in a polygamous setup, and consequently had children from all these 4 women. 12 sons came out of all of them. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of rivalry, especially between the other sons and Joseph, Rachel's son. They hated their brother because they thought that Jacob favored him, and perhaps Jacob did. He was, at some point, he was the only son of his favorite wife, Rachel. So, I'm sure he favored Joseph over the others quite often. But Joseph was also a good lad, just a good boy, right? He gifted Joseph a very colored cloak, driving the other brothers' hatred for Joseph through the roof, In any case, Jacob sent Joseph to take some food to his brothers out in the fields as they tended their sheep. And when they saw Joseph coming from afar, they plotted together to kill him. They hated him that much. Hated their own flesh and blood. And I should say, part of the reason they hated Joseph is because Joseph would have these dreams, visions, and he would tell his brothers. Some people fault Joseph for telling his brothers his dreams, but what they don't understand is Joseph was a prophet, right? Had he not told his brothers and his father and mother these dreams and visions of his, they would not have known when those visions were eventually fulfilled that they were from God. So it was important for Joseph to tell his brothers the dreams. Anyway, so they conspired to get rid of Joseph. Reuben and Judah intervened and thought that was on a level that they were not willing to participate in. They convinced the brothers instead to throw Joseph in a ditch, and they were planning later on to rescue their brother, to save him. But they were too late. The others saw some Ishmaelites on their way to Egypt and sold Joseph into slavery. This is important. This is a key point. They sold their own flesh and blood into slavery. Hopefully you know the rest of the story there. Joseph, if not, I will put the reference up here for you to check out. So Joseph ended up a slave in Egypt. He was a righteous young man, and so God blessed him. Eventually, he became the prime minister of Egypt, the second in command in all of the land. You have to understand, Egypt at the time was like a world power. Okay? So imagine the level of power and authority Joseph eventually had in Egypt. Tremendous. Then a famine happened, and Joseph sent his brothers there, and Jacob sent his sons there, and Joseph, being second in command and being in charge of the distribution of food, dealt with his brothers. He tested them, and once he found out that they had repented, he made himself known to them, and there was a big reunion. Eventually, he had his father, Jacob, and the whole family, about 80 people, move into Egypt. And they lived there in Goshen. And the scripture says, another king, after the Israelites had lived there and multiplied, another king arose in Egypt who didn't know much about Joseph, apparently. And he really sought to weaken the Israelites because he felt threatened by the sheer size of this nation within a nation. Right? They were just multiplying. He came up with schemes to have the baby boys born of the Hebrew women killed. That didn't work, right? Main point, the sons of Israel ended up as slaves. But I want you to connect the dots here as to how that happened. It was not because God appointed them to be slaves from the beginning. No. They put themselves there. They put themselves in that situation because they sold their own flesh and blood. Joseph, the brothers hated their own flesh and blood and sold him into bondage. And so, okay, they sowed. What they sowed, they reaped. Okay? They sowed hatred, they reaped the results from that. Now, how does this tie in with what happened to Africans? Were Africans living in peace? The different tribes in West Africa or Benin, or Nigeria, because some slaves came out of that area. At the time it wasn't, these places weren't known as Nigeria and Benin, Togo and Ghana and Ivory Coast, or even Burkina Faso. The Europeans created all of that. What was the relationship what were the relationships between tribes of Africans, West Africans? We know from history, it wasn't love. They hated each other. Okay? They were fighting each other, killing each other, okay, capturing each other and selling each other to the Europeans. That's what they were doing. Sorry to tell you, but Africans did not love each other. And we could talk about why they didn't. I'm just going to, let you know right now. It's because of the idols they worshipped. Okay? The demonic forces they subjected themselves to. That's how these things came about. Each tribe in Ghana, for example, has its own idols they worship. And even within a tribe, different families may have different idols that they worship. There's no unity. No unity. See, when we don't love our own flesh and blood, when we don't love and cherish our own flesh and blood, and we instead hate, the natural consequence of that is slavery. That's how this happened. Now, this doesn't somehow justify how, slaves were treated in the Americas. No, not at all. Right? Just as God said to Abraham, he would judge the nation that enslaved the Israelites. Egypt, God would judge them. God judges the nation of America for that the slave trade. Okay, God is judging everyone that's participated in this wicked institution. They're not, they don't escape culpability in this. I'm just talking about how it happened. And ultimately, the worship of idols causes division among people. Okay? Because idols themselves don't get along. Okay, they don't. Right? You think the people who worship them are going to get along? No. So this is what happened from the Bible's perspective. How Africans ended up as slaves, because they didn't love each other. They did not love one another. Had they loved one another, they would have united. Right? They would be one. And look at the size of Africa. There is no way that the Europeans would have been able to subjugate Africa if Africa had been united. I want to thank you for taking the time to look at this video. Have a blessed day, and I'm looking forward to putting out the next one soon.